welcome to video number 2 in terms of an introduction to conflict resolution. I'm thankful and appreciative again that you're joining me in this opportunity to learn more about conflict. And today we're going to talk about specifically what does it mean to be collaborative? What are the considerations in terms of engaging collaboratively? And what's our mindset? How do we then start to take into consideration the other person if they're not collaborative? Because again, it's not always about this appreciation or expectation that we're both coming into this conversation with this very collective, collaborative mindset. If that was the case, there would be very little, if any, conflict. So there is this dynamic that's going to exist, which relates to what we talked about in the last video, which is this mindset, family of origin, in which for many of us we've learned to deal with conflict from more of this adversarial dichotomy, right and wrong, win and lose, and good and bad. So we know that that exists. But in order for us to have a different conversation, what we're going to talk about now is that what does it first of all mean to be in conflict? What is conflict? And then the next piece is then how do we start to make that shift to one in which we want to be more collaborative in our endeavors of working with the other party, which means again that we're likely to receive more often than not some pushback, some defensiveness, some posturing, perhaps even aggressive communication, and even passive engagement in a conversation. What does it mean for us in terms of our ability to influence those conversations from a collaborative, interest-based opportunity? So to begin with, let's talk a little bit about what is conflict. So there's a number of factors, although it seems obvious in terms of what conflict is, but there are a number of factors to consider in terms of what is conflict. I think the first piece is to recognize that there has to be at least two people involved in terms of it being a conflict situation. Now, that seems pretty obvious. The piece here though is that, and some of you may have experienced this before, I know that I have, is that conflict can exist with me in terms of my interaction, my experience with the other person, and now I have this internal piece of conflict that I'm trying to work through, digest, and try to understand, and try to find a way to address it, if at all. And so at this point in time, the other person may not be aware. And although it can be obvious to us that there's conflict between the two of us, it may not necessarily mean that the other person has that same kind of experience, that same kind of awareness. So until it's made public, and by public what I mean is our presentation to the other person that there's something we need to talk to him or her about, it becomes unaddressed conflict. It becomes internal conflict. So it doesn't actually become conflict until both of us are having that conversation. I think the next piece then is to consider how we talk to one another. And appreciate again, conflict creates this emotional response to what's going on. We start to move more into our emotional brain in terms of how we're going to engage with the other party. Other person can be in the same spot in terms of that emotionality. That means then at this point in time, is for us to then enter into this conversation in a more collaborative manner, it's checking in with ourselves in terms of what is our intention. How are we wanting to engage with them? What is it that we want to share with them? How are we going to be with them? How are we going to address sort of the reactivity or defensiveness in terms of their response to what we're bringing forward? And this is the piece that I think sometimes becomes challenging, because we can have this collaborative intention of wanting to work with the party, of wanting to be open, of wanting to try to create an open space for this conversation to happen. And then we raise our concern with the other party. And it's not likely that people are going to warmly embrace this opportunity to talk about my concern with our relationship or your behavior. You're probably not going to get a response like, oh, well, thanks so much for raising that for me. Now let's have a wonderful collaborative conversation. Highly unlikely. What you're probably going to get is probably one of two approaches from the other party. One is going to be maybe more of this aggressive kind of approach, which can be seen in terms of justification, rationalization, defending, or you may start to get the reverse of that, which is people become more passive and now they start to shut down. Now they become quiet. And so if we recognize that dynamic and we're appreciating where they're at, as we talked about in the last video, they're doing the best they can with what they've got. They're feeling probably some degree of threat, some degree of judgment in terms of themselves, their character, how they want to be seen. So it challenges them in terms of all of that, including their ego. So when we get that kind of reaction in the other party, our opportunity now is to move away from the tendency, I think, for many of us to have, which is to sort of push back against that, which is to become more aggressive. And for some, it may even be that we start to feel so uncomfortable that now we start to shut down. Now we become more passive. Any of those dynamics now start to lose the momentum of a collaborative, open dialogue. So it's just appreciating that piece, is that it's really easy to slide back into more of that aggressive or passive or that dichotomy of right and wrong very quickly, especially when we start to feel uncomfortable or we're starting to feel that the other person is pushing back strongly against us. The other consideration in terms of conflict dynamic is this piece around perhaps I'm feeling as though in our conversation or how we are with one another is that it may be something that we may have this sense of incompatible goals, an inability to feel as though we can work with one another, perhaps feeling challenged in terms of being able to get the information, get the kind of engagement we're looking for. So now we're starting to feel as though that opportunity doesn't exist, and now we're starting to feel as though we're hitting a wall with this situation. A simple example is that if you're in an organization and you're relying on a coworker to provide you with information in order to move through a project in a timely manner, you're asking them for that information, they're not wanting to give it to you, or they're slow in giving it to you, is now your goal of being able to complete the project, of being seen successful, being able to be seen as efficient in your role, now gets challenged. And now all of a sudden that starts to create conflict just in terms of that piece. So it's this other dynamic then of just appreciating that all behavior makes sense. And I can certainly react strongly in more of a defensive manner. But I know that when I do that, I'm now sliding back into more of this adversarial orientation. So we want to be able to start to work with that rather than feel as though we have to push against it. And then the other piece that often comes up in terms of conflict are the differences that we have, or the perceived differences that we have with one another. And they can be many in terms of what those perceived differences can be. You know, one of the big things I think that comes up are the assumptions we make about someone's behavior, the interactions that I'm having with this particular individual. And I'm guessing that for many of us, you know, at first blush, we start to see something unfolding in front of us and it's starting to have this negative impact on us. It's amazing how quickly we go to sort of this negative internal narrative about my assumption about what they're doing and the intention of what they're trying to do, which is really negative, directed towards me. So assumption is big, and at some point we'll spend a little bit more time talking about how assumptions get created and how we can start to look at how to move through those assumptions in a more, again, collaborative manner. But it can be other things. It can be the expectations we have. And sometimes we hold some pretty strong and pretty high expectations, not only for ourselves, in terms of how we conduct ourselves, in terms of how we are to work through situations, but we can certainly have some very challenging expectations of the other party. And one of the things to consider here is, it's Shakespeare that said, I believe, expectation is at the root of all heartache. So if you expect someone, for example, in terms of raising a conversation with them about their behavior, and your expectation is, well, I'm going to treat them respectfully, I'm going to be open, I'm going to be considerate. And then as you raise this concern with this person, is that their immediate response now is to get defensive, is now to bite back, is now to start to judge you. It's really easy to all of a sudden, with that expectation in the back of our brain, now get challenged for us to all of a sudden automatically now start to challenge back. So again, it's just considering that, expectation in terms of what's going on in a conversation may not always help us in terms of how it can set us up for a way in which we become more reactive to it. But it can also be in terms of our communication, our style, our approach. It could be around role, position, gender. There can be a number of different things. The one thing to also think about is that when we talk about conflict and we talk about working through it, in the last video we talked about family of origin and the teachings that we have related to trying to address conflict. One of the things we didn't talk about, that I'm going to talk about now, is that we have a history of dealing with conflict, whether that is aggressive, passive, collaborative, whatever it may be. We have our histories, we have our experiences, and we will often bring those experiences in the present conflict situation. What I mean by that is that if I've in a situation now, presently, where I'm needing to deal with, let's say, someone that has positional power, or there's a gender issue here, is that my history and my experiences related to both of those will now start to play out in a very unconscious manner for me, and the same can hold true for the other party. So it's this appreciation that in some of these situations that are happening, this reaction you're getting, either through yourself or certainly through the other person, may have nothing to do with you. It may just be their histories that are now priming them and getting them prepared for what they believe is now going to unfold in this very negative experience. So what I'm suggesting here is that for individuals who haven't had positive experiences around conflict, is that if all of a sudden it looks like a duck, it starts to feel like a duck for me, starting to feel uncomfortable, then it is. And so now I start to move again in this more protective fashion. Just appreciate that. And again, I think it lends itself to our ability to, again, have more empathy for the other party. Especially when we start to say to ourselves, this acronym, which is QTIP, which is quit taking it personally, because it may have nothing to do with you. It may be their histories that are now getting ignited in this present situation that are really trying to, again, create a moment in which they need to take care of themselves and protect themselves. So just recognize that it's not always going to be easy for people to have these conversations, and even though you're wanting to be collaborative and you're wanting to work with them and you're wanting to be effective, it doesn't mean that that's going to sort of transcend another person's history of experience, negative, related to conflict, because that's a whole bunch of stuff that they're unconsciously trying to deal with in terms of trying to protect themselves in this current situation. So with all of that being said then, if we're starting to look at what does it mean to be collaborative then, and how do we start to move into that collaborative conversation? It's this mindset of making this shift, which is, it's not you versus me, right? We talked a lot about that in the last video. It's now this shift to it's us dealing with the situation or the issue. So we're changing it. We're taking the person out of it. It's not personal now. It's now focused on the issue. And that makes it easier, I think, to really start to understand what's going on when we take the personality out of the situation. It's also the shift away from, as we've talked about, this competitive nature. You know, it's not, we're not sort of wanting to win here, because we know if that's the mindset, it's only going to create more animosity, it's going to create more tension. What we want to have a mindset of is collaborativeness, is a degree of openness, curiosity. Those things are going to foster more of an opportunity of engagement with the other person. And then the other piece is that when we think about moving away from this competitive approach, and we're focusing on the relationship, is that we know that the goal of a collaborative approach is to try to enhance or improve the working relationship, whether that's personal or professional. So that's our intention, that's our goal, that's what we want to focus on. Making the shift to a collaborative approach also means, though, that we recognize that those relationships are important to us. And so we're approaching those with an intention of really wanting to understand, not feeling as though I have to defend. And it's also appreciating and recognizing that conflict will continue to be part of our experiences whenever we're involved in relationships, personal or professional. It also signifies to us, too, that we're not always going to see eye to eye. We are going to have differences. We are going to, as I mentioned earlier, make some assumptions about what's going on, which may not always be true. And so when that happens, we can see it as sort of this normal interaction that happens between the two of us. And so it's not about taking it personally. What it means is that there's an opportunity in which we can understand both perspectives. It's an opportunity in which we can share our experience with the other party, and to know that there's probably going to be some pushback, some resistance around that, but it doesn't mean we have to defend. It really is about how do we continue to maintain this collaborative effort to want to work with this other party. Those are some of the key pieces in terms of looking at the collaborative approach to dealing with conflict. I think, too, that when I think about this defensive or adversarial approach that many people take, is that there's this natural tendency, again, as I've mentioned, to self-protect. And if we sort of keep things in the back of our mind, which is conflict isn't easy, there are lots of challenges to it, people often react defensively, that people are often more of this adversarial place, trying to maintain their own sense of integrity, is that with a collaborative approach, we can actually influence the other party. And what I mean by that is that it means we are in a space in which we want to work with them. We're not creating any resistance. And when we're able to create that space of influence in the other party, it now starts to actually de-escalate the situation for the other party. Because when people feel heard and understood and validated for their perspective or concern, it kind of takes the wind out of the emotional sail for the other party. We're creating that space. So with that being said, when I talk about what is it in terms of a collaborative approach, that's a big piece. Being able to be in that space, being able to listen, have an openness to their thoughts without feeling as though I have to defend or justify, and that I can respect their perspective, because their perspective, their experience is their reality. It is their truth. And I'm sure that many of us have had conversations in which we've decided that what we're going to try to do is to convince the other person that they're wrong. Adversarial approach. But I think we've all had those kinds of conversations. What we know, though, is if we're trying to convince someone that they're wrong, is that that is really a bad use of our time, and that it's only going to foster more defensiveness, reactivity in the other party. Their perception is their reality. Fair enough. I have my own perception, I have my own reality. We can talk about that in an open manner in which there's no judgment. But that conversation creates the opportunity to understand one another, and it's through that understanding that now creates the opportunity for us to start to not only appreciate one another, but now we can start to figure out what is it that we need from one another in order to move forward in a more effective manner. And whether that's about dealing with what's brought us to this conversation, but it may also be about what do we want to talk about in terms of how do we want to address situations in a more timely manner as well, too. So it's really an opportunity to really start to address the relational dynamics in terms of communication and conflict. What we're also doing, though, is that when we're listening in this situation to hear what the other person has to say, is that we're also taking on an opportunity to demonstrate understanding. And we'll do that by repeating back what we've heard them say. That's the basic communication skill of paraphrasing. It's giving back what you've heard them say in your own words. It's this opportunity to demonstrate to this person that we're getting what their experience is, and we're providing that information in terms of our understanding and appreciation of that. Now, in order to do that, though, one of the first pieces to consider is our ability to be able to be present and to actively listen. And that's not always an easy thing, especially when we're feeling challenged by what somebody has to say. It's going to be really easy to get back into that place in which we feel as though we have to defend or justify. But to be able to be present in an active listening or an effective listening mode, we are paying attention to not only the words they're saying, we're paying attention to the emotions, we're paying attention to the nonverbals, so that we can really start to construct a message of understanding back to the other party. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some basic communication skills like acknowledging emotion, paraphrasing content, open questions, empathic response. We're going to get more in depth in terms of those communication skills and how it helps to assist in a collaborative dialogue. So when we're listening, when we're paraphrasing, we are validating, we are sharing with the person that we are taking the time to really understand what's important to them. And so when we do that again, as I mentioned earlier, that becomes a diffusing mechanism because again, we're not giving them anything to push back on. And so we're really in this place of just being with the other person. The other piece then to consider is as we are engaging with this person or as we're initiating this conversation is we want to also pay attention to our presentation. So the tone of our voice, the words we use, and certainly the non-verbal communication, because that's a big piece in terms of what we need to send to them, because it's all of what is going to be the collective message. And then in summary, if we think about the collaborative approach, what we're trying to do is, again, as I think I mentioned this earlier, is to try to repair, improve the relationship, whether that's personal or professional. And so what we're trying to achieve in terms of this collaborative approach is really about how do we be as present as we possibly can with the other party? How do we create this moment of demonstrating understanding? And if we're able to do that, then we're going to break this cycle of this statement react. You never listen to me? Yes, I do. No, you don't? Yes, I do. And we're really getting into this place in which you never listen to me to a change in, so you're not feeling heard, help me understand that. What do I need to know about that? We're inviting more information from them. And although that's not always a comfortable place to be, in doing that, it's creating the opportunity for the other person to self-express in a way in which they're feeling heard and understood. So that is basically the fundamentals of the shift from adversarial to collaborative. Being present, actively listening, encouraging the other person to speak more, so a high degree of curiosity related to some open questions. We are demonstrating understanding by reflecting back what we've heard them say, that we are recognizing that conflict isn't easy, that they're doing the best they can, that some of our histories or some of their histories now start to influence the conversation they're in right now, which may have nothing to do with you. It's their own stuff, so quit taking it personally if you can. And really trying to be in a conversation in which we are really trying to understand them and work with them. And then once we've demonstrated that and we've summarized all of the concerns and all of the messages that they need to share with us, we're then able to then take on the next piece, which is our ability to now start to self-disclose our stuff. Because what we want to be able to do is to create an environment in which we listen to understand first before we speak to be understood. So it takes some time, it takes some effort, and it really does take some patience for ourselves and for the other party. The homework that I'd like you to consider in terms of this shift to more of a collaborative approach is, what concerns do you have about entering into a conversation in which you're wanting to listen, in which you're wanting to understand, in which you are trying to get more information, so more curiosity, having them speak more in this emotional space. Like what goes on for you? What's your concern? What do you see as an opportunity in this? And then how are you going to make that happen? Because we've talked about what the challenges are in terms of our histories around conflict, more adversarial, to now one which is a shift, which is being more collaborative. Now, I know there's a lot of potential questions around, well, what if they do this or what if they do that? We're going to get more into that for sure. But in order to navigate a conversation which is going to be more fulsome, the opportunity rests for you in terms of how you present and how you create a space in which they can now talk about what their concerns are, even though you may have been the one that initiated it. You're probably going to get some pushback from that. Be okay to be other focused, be okay to be able to understand, be okay to be able to validate and paraphrase and demonstrate understanding, because in doing that, as I've mentioned, it starts to diffuse and de-escalate their emotional intensity. That's the space where a different conversation can now start to happen. So think about that. Think about what you might want to do. Think about what you've done in terms of your own reactivity in these situations, and notice that there's probably a tendency to be more defensive. And what would it take for you to move away from the defensive sort of response to one that's more collaborative and curious? That is the beginning of making this shift into a more collaborative, engaging conversation. So I'd like you to take some time to really think about what is it that you want to consider doing differently. And if there's any questions you have related to that, by all means, feel free to send those as well too. So next video, we're going to talk more about some of the basic communication skills in terms of navigating this conversation. So again, thank you for your time. I appreciate you being with me on this learning journey. And I look forward to seeing you in our third video.